She snuck into a human's house just to shower. "Please, let me wash. I'm so dirty," she begged.
Leroy Vosk pushed the door open to his apartment with the same tired motion he repeated every evening. His hand was damp from the rain, his coat heavy with the weight of water, and his head throbbed faintly from staring at freight records for 10 straight hours. He lived in one of the cheaper blocks near the registry towers, the kind of housing clerks could afford if they stayed out of trouble and didn't expect much comfort. His life was built around routine. Unlock the door, hang the coat, heat a ration tin, and read until fatigue took over. That predictability was how he survived in a district where chaos often lived in the streets. But tonight, something broke the routine. He stepped inside and froze before even setting down his satchel. His apartment was not silent. A steady hiss filled the air. Water, running water. For a moment, he thought a pipe had burst, and his pulse jumped because repairs meant weeks of paperwork and deductions. Then he realized the sound was too regular, too contained. It was his shower. Someone was in it. Leroy's chest tightened. His mind raced through possibilities: a thief, a drunk who stumbled into the wrong unit, or something worse. He locked his door every time without fail, checked the bolt twice, sometimes 3 times. He dropped the satchel quietly and scanned the flat. The kitchen window was still latched. The front door had been secure. Then he saw it. The narrow rear corridor's window was ajar, rain dripping through the crooked frame. Someone had forced their way in. He picked up the mop handle from beside the wall. It wasn't much, but it gave him something to hold. His heart beat harder as he walked toward the bathroom. Steam leaked through the thin crack of the door, carrying the unmistakable scent of soap. He stopped, listening. The water kept falling. No other sound. He weighed his choices. Called building security. Wait in the hall until they came. But security rarely showed up fast, and if it was another homeless vagrant, they would drag the intruder out, maybe beat them, maybe worse. Leroy pictured that outcome and felt an uncomfortable knot in his stomach. He wasn't built for violence, but he wasn't built for cruelty either. He knocked once, hard enough for the sound to carry. "Who's in there?" His voice came out harsher than intended, sharpened by nerves. The water didn't stop, but a voice cut through the steam, hoarse and trembling. "I'm not stealing. I just needed a wash." Leroy's grip loosened on the mop handle. A woman. Not a threat in the way he'd expected. He opened the door a fraction. Steam poured out, fogging his glasses, and he wiped them with his sleeve. The bulb above the shower threw stark white light across the small tiled room. And then he saw her. A woman stood under the spray, her back half turned to him. Blue skin gleamed where the water cut away dirt, and long strands of wet green hair clung to her shoulders. Her clothes were little more than ruined scraps. A torn halter that sagged against her chest, a short skirt held together by frayed straps, both so soaked with mud they revealed more than they hid. She scrubbed at her arms as if trying to erase layers of filth, her body trembling from exhaustion more than fear. She turned her head slowly, just enough for him to catch the glow in her alien eyes. They weren't hostile. They were desperate. "Please," she said, voice breaking. "Don't throw me out. I'll leave after. Just let me be clean once." Leroy's throat went dry. Every rational thought told him to force her out. She had broken into his home. She had crossed the line between stranger and intruder. But looking at her, shaking, covered in grime, begging for nothing more than the right to wash, made him hesitate. He had seen her kind in the streets before. Outsiders. Workers pushed out when their contracts ended. Most people avoided them. They were easy targets for harassment, treated like pests rather than people. He lowered the mop handle and leaned it against the wall. "What did you get in?" he asked. His tone stayed sharp, but his hands no longer gripped the wood. She nodded toward the corridor window. The latch was broken. "I heard the pipes. I followed the sound." Her words came slowly, deliberate, as if she was used to explaining herself to people who never listened. Leroy looked at the water meter on the wall. It flashed yellow, warning him of consumption above quota. His landlord would notice. He knew he'd be billed for it, yet his hand moved without thought. He pressed the reset switch, silencing the alarm. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, he'd just covered for her. She stopped scrubbing and stood still under the spray. Steam curled around her. "If you want me gone, Say it now, she whispered. Leroy opened the cabinet, pulled out a towel, the clean one he rarely used, and held it out. His voice was steady this time. Finish, then dry off. For a moment, she didn't move. Her eyes searched his face, waiting for the trick, the moment of cruelty she had learned to expect. But when none came, her lips pressed together and she nodded once. Thank you. He shut the door quietly and stepped into the hall, leaning against the wall as the sound of water continued behind him. His pulse still hammered, but his fear was shifting into something else. Stress mixed with curiosity, and unease about what he had just decided. He knew nothing about her. He didn't even know her name. Yet he had already chosen not to turn her out. And for the first time in years, Leroy Vosk felt the weight of routine give way to something unpredictable and dangerous. The door clicked shut behind Leroy, and he stood in the narrow hall with the steam pressing against his back. His pulse slowed, but not enough. He rubbed his hand across his brow, the moisture from the damp air leaving his skin clammy. He asked himself the questions anyone else would have asked in his place. Who was she really? Why this building? Why his apartment? And what would happen if a neighbor discovered her here? He had no answers, only fragments of guesses, and the uncertainty unsettled him. The water shut off. Silence filled the flat, broken only by the drip of rain outside and the faint hum of the faulty light above him. He expected hesitation, maybe the sound of a window opening as she slipped away the way she came. Instead, the bathroom door opened. She stepped into the hall barefoot, the towel wrapped tightly around her body, drops of water falling from her long green hair to the wooden floor. Her skin looked clearer now, the grime washed away, revealing the luminous blue beneath. She wasn't the shadowed figure from a moment ago. She was striking, even in exhaustion. Leroy forced his voice to stay even. You said you're not a thief. Then tell me, why here? There are dozens of other buildings. Why my place? She looked at him directly, as if she expected the interrogation and had been preparing for it. Because I saw you before, she said, at the south corridor. You left bread near the runoff pipe. You thought no one noticed, but I did. Her eyes tightened slightly. That told me enough. You don't kick people when they're already on the ground. Leroy's stomach tightened. He remembered that day. He had passed by on his way home, seen a figure crouched by the drainage line, and left a piece of his ration without a word. He hadn't thought she would recognize him. He hadn't thought it mattered. He motioned toward the kitchen, keeping his tone measured. Sit. Eat something before you leave. Her jaw set, and for a second it seemed she would argue, but hunger betrayed her. She followed him, the towel clinging as she walked. She sat at the small table, upright, cautious, every move deliberate, as if she expected the food to come with conditions. Leroy set bread, a tin of fruit, and a cup of water in front of her. He didn't speak as she took the bread, broke it, and ate in small bites. She chewed slowly, careful not to look desperate, even though her shaking hands betrayed her. Do you have a name? He asked finally. Orvea, she said. The word carried weight, as if speaking it aloud cost her something. Leroy, he replied, though she already knew. He sat across from her, his eyes steady on hers. Where did you come from before the streets? Her fingers tightened around the cup, but she didn't look away. Workers' quarter. The company ended the contracts when they downsized. They kept the men who could still lift and throw. Women like me were sent out. No shelter, no credits, no place to go. She sipped the water before finishing. If you stay too long in the alleys, the streets decide what you are. They decided I was trash. The flat grew heavy with silence. Leroy knew the truth of her words. He had seen the evictions, the camps, the way the colony bled its laborers dry and discarded them. He had turned his eyes away like everyone else because it was easier not to see. Yet here she was, sitting in his chair, eating his food, forcing him to look. You broken my home, he said finally. His tone was calm, but the words were blunt. You understand what that means. She didn't flinch. I know. If you send me out now, I won't make it through the night. Not with the cold. Not with the rain. She placed the last bite of bread carefully on the plate, as if to prove she wasn't greedy. That's the choice you have. Turn me out and be safe, or let me stay and risk whatever comes with me. Her honesty hit harder than any excuse would have. Leroy leaned back, exhaling slowly. He realized what bothered him wasn't the danger she brought, but the fact she spoke the truth so plainly. She wasn't bargaining. She wasn't manipulating him. She was asking him to make a decision no one else would bother making. He stood, opened the cupboard, and pulled out another towel. He dropped it on the table beside her. "Stay tonight. Tomorrow, we'll see." For the first time, her shoulders loosened. She didn't smile, but her voice softened. "That's enough." Leroy poured tea into a cracked cup and slid it toward her. As the steam rose between them, he realized the flat didn't feel like his anymore. It felt different, unsettled, uncertain, alive in a way it hadn't in years. He didn't know if letting her stay was the right decision, but he knew one thing clearly. His life had just shifted, and nothing would return to the routine it had been. The apartment was quiet after Orvea's voice fell silent, but Leroy couldn't settle. He sat at the edge of his narrow cot, staring at the floor, hearing the faint drip of water from her hair as she moved about in the kitchen. He had told her she could stay the night, yet part of him still questioned what that meant. Was he harboring a stranger, a liability, someone who could turn his life upside down? Or had he simply refused to be like the others who passed her in the alleys without looking twice? He wasn't sure which truth weighed more heavily. She returned from the kitchen carrying the towel he had given her earlier, folded now, carefully placed on the table as though she wanted to prove she hadn't ruined it. Leroy noticed how deliberate her actions were. No waste, no sudden movements, as if every gesture had been practiced for survival. He realized then what the listeners of this story might already be asking themselves. How long had she been living this way? Without shelter, without basic safety, forced to measure her every action so she wouldn't lose even the little she had? Orvea sat down, her voice low but steady. "Where do you want me to sleep?" Leroy hesitated. His cot could barely hold one. The floorboards were warped, cold, and unforgiving. He glanced toward the rolled blanket in the corner. "Take the cot. I'll manage out here." Her eyes flicked up sharply, a flash of pride cutting through the exhaustion. "I didn't come to replace you in your own bed." "You're not replacing me," Leroy said. "You're surviving. There's a difference." She studied him for a long second, searching his face for mockery or pity. When she found none, her posture softened just slightly. She nodded, though she still seemed uncomfortable. She lay down carefully, not like someone resting, but like someone lying in a place she didn't believe she belonged. Leroy pulled the blanket from the corner, stretched out on the floor, and tried to convince his body to relax. The night crept forward. Rain knocked against the window frames, and somewhere in the pipes a valve clicked. Leroy's eyes stayed open longer than usual, thoughts running faster than he could calm them. He kept going back to what she had said at the table. "Turn me out and be safe, or let me stay and risk whatever comes with me." The words felt like a warning and a plea wrapped together, and he didn't know which one would prove true. When he finally turned over, he caught the faintest sound. Orvea's breathing wasn't even. It hitched occasionally, the way it did when someone tried to force themselves to sleep while their body stayed on alert. He thought about asking if she was all right, but the question would only sound foolish. Of course, she wasn't all right. She was lying in the home of a stranger because every other door had been closed to her. Morning came slower than usual, gray light slipping through the cracked blinds. Leroy woke to the smell of heat on metal. He pushed himself up and found Orvea in the kitchen. She had tied the towel tight around her like a makeshift dress, and her long green hair fell damp across her shoulders. She stood at the stove, one of his old pans in her hand, heating what little food he had left. "You don't have to," Leroy started. She cut him off gently but firmly. "If I stay, I contribute. Even with nothing, I do something." She glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "I won't be treated like a burden." The comment carried weight, and Leroy realized another question that hung unspoken in the earlier chapters. Why had she been cast out so quickly when others kept their contracts longer? He didn't ask directly, but she must have sensed it in his silence because she added, "They said I wasn't strong enough to keep pace. Too much time spent ill. Too much cost for too little work. They don't care what happens after. Once you're marked as unproductive, you're invisible." The bluntness of it silenced him. He poured water into 2 cups and placed one near her hand. "You're not invisible here," he said quietly. Her eyes met his, and for the first time since he had found her in the shower, something in her expression shifted. Not trust yet, but the smallest trace of relief. She slid the pan toward him, splitting what little food she had prepared into 2 portions, making certain his share was equal. They sat at the table again, the silence less strained than before. She ate in steady bites, still measured but no longer hiding the fact she was hungry. Leroy watched her movements, thought about how every decision she made was shaped by years of being discarded, by knowing she was always one step from being thrown out again. He realized that if she stayed, it wouldn't only be about giving her food and a roof. It would be about convincing her that she could exist without apology. When the meal was done, she placed the plate carefully on the counter, then turned to him. "You said tomorrow we'll see. It's tomorrow now." Leroy leaned back in his chair. He hadn't prepared an answer. The truth was simple but dangerous. He didn't want her gone. Yet the longer she stayed, the more complicated his life would become. People noticed things. Neighbors gossiped. Questions were asked. Still, when he looked at her standing there, towel tied tight, hair dripping, shoulders squared with stubborn pride, he couldn't bring himself to force her back into the streets. "You can stay another day," he said finally, his tone flat but certain. "We'll decide again after that." She exhaled, a sound that wasn't quite a sigh and not quite a laugh, but something caught between. "That's all I ask. One day at a time." And in that moment, Leroy knew the path he was stepping onto. It wasn't safe. It wasn't simple. But for the first time in years, his life wasn't just about routine. It was about choice, and the choice he had made was her. The second morning passed much like the first, but with one clear difference. Orvea moved through the small apartment as though she had begun to learn its rhythm. She no longer lingered in the corner waiting for permission before touching something. She poured water into the kettle herself, swept crumbs from the table after their meal, and folded the blanket Leroy had used on the floor. Her presence, once startling, was now woven into the routine. And yet, every small action carried tension, as if she was testing boundaries and waiting for the moment he would change his mind. Leroy noticed it and wondered if she could read his silence as easily as she read the world outside. He had told her one day at a time, but even he realized what that really meant. He was giving her hope without knowing if he could sustain it. Still, he didn't send her out. Not that morning, not that night. By the third day, she was wearing one of his old shirts, the fabric loose on her frame, but decent enough compared to the torn rags she had arrived in. He caught himself staring when she stretched her arms, the collar slipping open, the shape of her body outlined in a way that was impossible to ignore. He turned his eyes away quickly, ashamed at his own thoughts, but Orvea noticed. She didn't call him out. She simply continued, her expression unreadable. It was then that another question surfaced, one left unspoken since her arrival. Did anyone else know she was gone? Did anyone still look for her? In the first chapters, Leroy had assumed she had been discarded and forgotten. But on that third day, as she washed a pot at the sink, she spoke without being asked. "No one will come for me," she said. "Not family, not employers, not neighbors." When the contract ended, the quarter guards walked me past the gates and locked them behind me. "That was the last time anyone said my name before you did." Her words settled heavy in the room. Leroy felt the weight of them, because now he understood the full truth. She wasn't just hiding here temporarily. She had nowhere else. If he turned her out, there was no second chance waiting. That realization made the decision he had been postponing feel sharper. The first real test came later that week. A knock sounded at his door in the early evening. 2 short raps, the kind neighbors used when they wanted to borrow something or complain. Orvea stiffened instantly, retreating toward the bathroom like a shadow. Leroy opened the door a crack and found old Mrs. Denner from 2 doors down, her eyes narrowing as she glanced past him into the flat. "Water leak last night?" she asked. Pipes were rattling louder than usual. "Just the heater," Leroy lied without hesitation. His voice stayed calm, his face neutral. He had never been a good liar at work, but in that moment the words came easily. Denner frowned, muttered something about maintenance, and left. When he closed the door, Orvea stepped out, her eyes sharp. "You covered for me," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I didn't want questions," Leroy replied. She studied him for a long second, then nodded once. "Then I'll be careful with the noise." It struck him then, She was adapting, shaping herself to fit this space, even though she had every reason not to trust it. And he was adapting too, already lying to neighbors without thinking twice. He realized what listeners of this story might ask. Why risk himself for someone he had just met? The answer, though unspoken, was in every glance he gave her when she wasn't looking. She wasn't just another outcast. She had become part of his routine, and losing her now felt unthinkable. That night, while she dried her hair with the towel, Leroy sat at the table, forcing himself to ask the question that had lingered since the beginning. Why did you stay when I caught you? Her hand slowed. She looked at him with an expression both tired and defiant. Because running again would mean I was guilty. Because if you're going to throw me out, I wanted you to do it looking at me. Not as a shadow, not as a thief, as myself. He didn't know how to respond. The honesty left him raw. All he could do was meet her gaze and nod. For the first time since she had arrived, Orvea allowed herself a faint smile. It was small, almost imperceptible, but real. She sat across from him, hair falling damp across her shoulders, and for a moment the flat felt less like a hiding place and more like the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Leroy lay awake longer than usual that night, listening to her slow, even breathing from the cot. He thought about the days before she came, the quiet predictability he had once valued, and realized he no longer wanted that silence. What he feared most wasn't the risk of neighbors or the questions from the outside world. It was the possibility that she might leave on her own. The days stretched into a quiet rhythm that neither of them acknowledged out loud. Leroy woke earlier now, not because he wanted to, but because he found himself listening for the faint sounds of movement from the other side of the room. The soft scrape of Orvea pulling a chair, the low splash of water in the sink, the shuffle of her bare feet across the floorboards. Her presence, once intrusive, had become part of the apartment's pulse. He no longer thought of the flat as his alone, and that realization unsettled him in ways he didn't admit, not even to himself. One morning, he found her standing at the window, the old shirt she wore pulled loosely over her frame, her long green hair catching the gray light that leaked through the cracked blinds. She didn't notice him at first, and he saw the way her hand pressed lightly against the glass, as if testing whether there was still something waiting for her outside. When she turned and caught him watching, her posture stiffened. "I was just looking," she said, her voice quieter than usual. Leroy nodded, though he felt the weight of a question forming inside him. Would she leave if she found another option? He didn't ask. Instead, he went to the stove, lit the coil, and set the kettle down. He noticed her watching him in return, her eyes tracking his movements with the same guarded attention she gave to strangers in the streets. That tension between them, watching, waiting, not speaking what they really thought, had become its own language. Later that day, while he sorted through work papers at the table, Orvea crossed the room with a folded blanket in her arms. She set it beside him without a word. He looked up, expecting her to step back, but she remained close, the faint scent of soap and clean skin breaking through the usual dust of the apartment. He swallowed and asked, "Do you always move this quietly?" Her lips curved faintly, almost a smile. When you spend years being unwanted, you learn to take up less space. Quieter footsteps, shorter breaths. People notice less that way. She paused, her eyes meeting his with sudden sharpness. "But here, I'm still learning how much noise I'm allowed to make." The words caught him off guard. He put the pen down. "You don't have to measure yourself here," he said, though he knew how thin that promise sounded. She tilted her head slightly, as if testing whether he truly meant it. That night, as rain hammered against the windows, the fragile line between them shifted. The cot creaked as Orvea shifted in her sleep, pulling the thin blanket tighter, but the draft from the broken seal along the frame made her shiver. Leroy heard it and sat up from the floor. He hesitated, every thought in his head clashing, propriety, caution, the fear of sending the wrong signal. But then he crossed a short space and draped his own blanket over her. Her eyes opened halfway. For a moment, she looked at him without speaking, her gaze tired but alert. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "I know," he said simply. She studied him for a long moment, then lifted the edge of the blanket, just enough to motion him closer. The gesture wasn't an invitation to anything beyond warmth. but carried weight all the same. Leroy hesitated only a breath before lying down on the narrow cot beside her, careful not to press too close. The two of them lay stiffly at first, shoulder to shoulder, the silence louder than the rain outside. Slowly, her breathing steadied, and she let her head rest against him, her damp hair brushing his cheek. Leroy stared at the ceiling, every nerve awake, every doubt still echoing, but beneath it all was something new, the quiet certainty that this closeness wasn't a mistake. It was survival. It was trust. As the night deepened, he realized what listeners of their story might already be asking. Was this the beginning of desire, or was it simply necessity? For him, it was both. For her, it seemed to be a test. Either way, neither of them pulled away. The following days blurred together, not because they were uneventful, but because they carried a rhythm Leroy had never known before. He returned from work each evening to find Orveus still there, washing the dishes, sweeping the corner, or simply sitting at the table with her damp hair falling over her shoulders, as though the apartment had always been hers as much as his. The initial shock of her presence had passed, yet the tension hadn't vanished. It had shifted into something quieter, heavier, like a current flowing just beneath the surface. One night, after another long day in the registry, Leroy unlocked the door and stepped inside, expecting the same muted silence. Instead, he heard her humming softly in the kitchen. The sound was faint, uncertain, as if she hadn't used her voice for such a thing in years. He paused in the doorway, watching her stir a small pot of soup. The old shirt she wore was belted at the waist with a strip of cloth she had cut from a ruined skirt, giving it shape. Her bare legs caught the dim light from the stove. For the first time, the space felt less like a hiding place and more like a home. She noticed him watching. The humming stopped. "It's not much," she said, nodding toward the pot, "but it's warm." Leroy set his satchel down, his throat dry. "You didn't have to." Her eyes flicked to his. "I wanted to. You gave me a place to breathe. Let me give something back." They ate together in silence, though the air between them felt different now. Less like survival, more like something unspoken pressing at the edges. When a meal was done, she placed her spoon carefully on the table, then looked at him. "Do you ever regret it?" "Regret what?" he asked, letting me stay. Risking the questions, risking the whispers. Leroy held her gaze. No, the answer came before he could think. It surprised even him with its certainty. Her lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected that. She leaned back, her towel-dried hair sliding over her shoulder. Most people would. Most people did. He wanted to ask who she meant, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers. It wasn't planned. It wasn't calculated. It was instinct. The contact was brief, but the way her fingers froze, then curled ever so slightly toward his, made his pulse quicken. The silence stretched too long. She broke it first. "If you want me gone, say it now. I'll leave clean. I won't beg." Leroy shook his head, his voice low. "I don't want you gone." She stood slowly, her bare feet whispering against the floorboards, and walked around the table. She stopped close enough that he could see every line of her face, every faint mark the streets had carved into her skin. Her pride hadn't left her. It was in the set of her shoulders, the steady glow of her eyes. But beneath it was something more fragile, something she was risking just by standing so near. "Then see me," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Not as a burden, not as pity. See me." Leroy rose to his feet. His hands hovered at his sides, uncertain. For a second, fear surged. Fear of making the wrong move, fear of breaking the fragile trust between them. But then he met her eyes, and all he saw there was the same uncertainty mirrored back. Slowly, carefully, he lifted a hand and brushed a strand of green hair from her cheek. She didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch. Their lips met. Not rushed, not forced. A slow, searching kiss, hesitant at first, then deeper as both gave in to what they had been holding back. Leroy felt the warmth of her body against his, the faint tremor in her shoulders as she pressed closer. His hands found her waist, and hers curled lightly at the back of his neck. When they parted, breathless, she whispered, "You don't know what this means for me." "Then tell me," he said softly. "It means I'm not invisible anymore." The words cut through him sharper than anything else she could have said. He kissed her again, slower this time, and she let herself rest against him, her guard lowered for the first time since the night he found her in a shower. That night, she didn't retreat to the cot. She sat beside him until exhaustion pulled her under, her head against his shoulder. Leroy stayed awake long after, staring into the dim light, knowing there was no going back. The line between survival and intimacy had been crossed, and for once he didn't feel fear. He felt certainty. The morning after the kiss, the air in the apartment felt heavier, though neither spoke about it at first. Leroy moved through his routine, boiling water, setting out bread, but every movement carried a new awareness. When Orvea crossed the room, her arm brushed as lightly, and the simple touch sent a ripple through him. She wore the same shirt as before, belted with the strip of fabric, but now it seemed different, less like borrowed clothing and more like something she had claimed as her own. They ate in silence, yet silence no longer felt like distance. It felt charged, alive. Where her eyes met his across the table, she didn't look away as quickly as she once did. Instead, she held his gaze, testing how long he would meet it. He didn't look away either. Later, as he prepared to leave for work, she stood by the door watching him tie his boots. "You'll come back tonight?" she asked. The question was simple, but her voice carried an edge, as though she had braced herself for disappointment. "Always," Leroy said. His answer was quiet but certain. He hadn't realized until then how much she needed that assurance, and how much he needed to give it. That evening, the rain still beat against the glass when he returned. Orvea was sitting cross-legged on the cot, her green hair falling loosely over her shoulders, the shirt slipping off one shoulder where she hadn't bothered to fix it. She looked up as he entered, studying him in silence, then said, "You're late." He frowned. Not by much. Her lips curved faintly. I noticed. They ate together again, then sat by the window, listening to the storm. The closeness between them had shifted. Where once she had guarded herself, now she leaned against him more freely, her hand brushing his on the ledge, staying there when he didn't move it. Leroy felt his chest tighten at the simple contact. She spoke after a long silence. "I used to think touch was only a bargain. Something traded, something taken. But when you kissed me, it felt different." She turned her face toward him, eyes steady. It felt like choice. He swallowed, his voice low. "It was choice. Mine. Yours." She shifted closer, her thigh against his now, the warmth of her body undeniable. "Then what happens if we choose again?" Leroy met her gaze. This time, there was no hesitation. He leaned forward, and their lips met again, deeper than before, no longer tentative but certain. She moved into him, her hands finding his chest, his arms circling her waist. The kiss was slow but filled with urgency, the kind born not of lust alone, but of months of denial, of lives spent starved of closeness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unevenly, she rested her forehead against his. "I don't want to live as if tomorrow will take this away," she whispered. "I want to belong here, with you." "You already do," Leroy said. The words came out steady, but inside he felt the weight of them. He hadn't planned to say it, but it was the truth. That night, she didn't retreat to her corner or wait for him to move to the floor. She pulled the blanket aside on the cot and looked at him, her eyes clear, not demanding but inviting. He lay down beside her, and this time there was no hesitation, no careful distance. Their bodies pressed together naturally, her head against his chest, his hand resting at her hip. They didn't sleep quickly. Their breaths sank slowly, their hands exploring with caution, tracing small, reassuring touches across skin and fabric. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't forced. It was trust growing into something stronger, something more intimate. For Leroy, it was the first time he felt he wasn't alone. For Orvea, it was the first time closeness wasn't survival but comfort. Outside, the storm carried on, but inside the apartment, the world had changed. They had crossed another line, one that neither wanted to retreat from. The storm finally broke the next morning. When Leroy woke, the air was clearer, fresher than it had been in weeks. Sunlight slipped through the blinds, painting pale lines across the floor. He opened his eyes to find Orvea still curled against him, her green hair draped across his chest, her breathing slow and even. For the first time since she entered his home, she wasn't tense in her sleep. She wasn't waiting for rejection or a command. She was resting deeply as if she belonged. He lay still, not wanting to break the moment, but she stirred anyway, blinking up at him with tired eyes. For a second, her face tightened, as though she expected to wake in the alleys again. But when she realized where she was, she let out a small breath. "You're still here," she said softly. "I told you," Leroy replied. "I'm not going anywhere." She shifted, sitting up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The morning light caught the faint glow of her skin, making her seem even more vivid against the gray of the room. She looked at him carefully, searching his face as if weighing whether this was truly the moment to ask what she had been holding back. "Do you mean it?" she asked. "Not just for another day. Not just until it's inconvenient. Do you mean I can stay?" Leroy sat up too, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "Yes, stay. Not as a guest. Not as someone passing through. Stay here, with me." The silence stretched. Her lips parted, her eyes glistened. For a moment, she didn't seem to know how to respond. Then she laughed quietly, almost disbelieving, before pressing her hand against his chest. "No one has ever said that to me," she whispered. "Not once. Not even when I had a home before." Leroy reached for her hand, holding it firmly. "Then let this be the first time. And the last time you have to ask." The weight in her expression lifted, and she leaned forward, kissing him with a certainty that hadn't been there before. There was no hesitation this time, no testing, no fear. It was commitment. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his, her voice steady. "Then I'm yours. And you're mine." The day unfolded with a new rhythm. She cleaned the apartment with a quiet efficiency, humming under her breath, while Leroy rearranged shelves to make space for a few belongings. The strip of cloth, the worn comb, the small pouch of coins she had once insisted on leaving behind. For the first time, he imagined the flat not as a place he returned to alone, but as a shared space. A home. That evening, they sat by the window again. The city below was still wet from the storm, neon lights flickering across puddles in the street. Orvea leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her fingers entwined with his. "Do you think they'll notice?" she asked quietly. "That I'm gone from the alleys. That I'm here. Let them notice," Leroy said. His voice carried no fear. "We don't answer to them." She turned her face toward him, smiling. Not a small, cautious smile, but a full, unguarded one that reached her eyes. For the first time since he had met her, she looked free. As the night settled in, they lay together on the cot, no longer tentative, no longer waiting for tomorrow to tear them apart. Their bond had grown past survival, past pity, into something solid, something chosen. When sleep finally took them, the apartment was no longer just Leroy's, and Orvea was no longer just a guest. They were partners, equals, bound not by chance but by choice. The story ended not with uncertainty or fear, but with clarity. They had built a home, and they had chosen each other. Whatever the world outside thought no longer mattered. Several weeks passed before either of them noticed how different life had become. The apartment no longer felt temporary or fragile. It carried the small marks of permanence. An extra towel folded neatly beside Leroy's own, Orvea's belt of fabric hanging on the wall, as if it belonged there. 2 cups left drying side by side instead of one. The neighbors had stopped asking questions, their curiosity dulled by the passing days. And inside, the silence between Leroy and Orvea was no longer defensive. It was comfortable, familiar, and warm. One evening, the air outside was calm for once. No storm, no rattling pipes, only a quiet hum from the city below. Leroy returned later than usual, his shoulders heavy from a long day, but the moment he opened the door, the heaviness faded. Orvea was there, standing by the stove, her long green hair brushed and tied loosely behind her shoulders, wearing one of his shirts but altered with small stitches of her own. She looked up at him with a smile that carried no hesitation. "You're late," she said, the same word she had used weeks ago, but this time her tone was teasing, soft. "Am I forgiven?" Leroy asked. "That depends," she replied, stepping closer, her eyes steady on his. "What did you bring me?" He set the small bundle on the table, fruit, rarer than their usual rations. She unwrapped it carefully, touched the skin of the fruit with almost reverence, then looked back at him. "You think this will earn forgiveness?" He shrugged, but the corner of his mouth curved. "It's a start." They ate together, and the ease between them was undeniable. There was no tension of waiting for tomorrow's decision, no fear of rejection. For the first time, their future felt certain. Orvea leaned across the table halfway through the meal, brushing his hand with hers. She didn't look away when he caught her gesture. She held his gaze instead. Later that night, they sat on the cot together. Orvea rested her head against his shoulder, then turned toward him, her lips brushing his jaw. Her voice was low, deliberate. "Do you want me?" He answered without pause. "Yes." She leaned closer, pressing her lips to his, slow and lingering. The kiss deepened quickly, her hand sliding to the back of his neck, pulling him toward her. He shifted, his arms circling her waist, drawing her onto his lap. For a moment, they both froze, as if realizing the weight of what they were choosing. Then neither pulled back. Her shirt slipped loose under his hands, the fabric falling aside to reveal the smooth glow of her blue skin. She let it drop, unashamed, her chest rising and falling against his. Her green hair spilled forward, brushing across his cheek as she kissed him again, hungrier this time. He laid her back gently, the cot creaking beneath their weight, and she reached up, guiding his hand over her body with certainty. The next moments unfolded slowly, deliberately. Every movement was cautious at first, then bolder as trust turned into urgency. Their bodies pressed together fully, skin against skin, breath mingling in the close air of the room. Leroy felt the warmth of her thighs tighten around him, the arch of her back as she moved beneath him. Orvea's voice broke in a soft sound she tried to stifle at first, but he whispered against her ear, "Don't hold back," and she didn't. The intimacy deepened, raw and consuming, but never rushed. His hands explored her curves with reverence, hers traced along his chest and arms, pulling him closer with every motion. They moved together until exhaustion blurred the edges of time. The small apartment filled not with rain or silence, but with the rhythm of their bodies and their voices. When it was over, Orvea lay against him, her skin damp, her breathing steadying slowly. She lifted her head just enough to look into his eyes. "You didn't just give me shelter," she said, her voice faint but certain. "You gave me back myself." Leroy brushed a hand over her hair, pulling her close. "And you gave me more than I ever thought I'd have." The night stretched on, the city outside indifferent, but inside their small home, everything had changed. They weren't strangers, weren't survivors clinging to scraps. They were partners, lovers, a man and a woman who had chosen each other fully. And as they drifted into sleep in each other's arms, there were no questions left, no doubts about tomorrow. Only the certainty that they had found a future together, one they would never give back.